This was supposed to be the future of Starfleet, a revolutionary new starship built around a revolutionary new propulsion system, designed to leave ships like the Enterprise long behind. Starfleet called it the Great Experiment, and when the moment finally came to show everyone what their new starship could do, it went absolutely nowhere. If you love Star Trek and the starship designs we're talking about, hit the subscribe button to never miss a video from a Trek Central crew. Also, while you're watching, comment below what you would name an Excelsior-class if you were to command one. The USS Excelsior wasn't supposed to be just another starship. This was NX-2000, the prototype for an entirely new generation of Starfleet vessel. Bigger, newer, and more advanced than the Constitution-class ships which had defined Starfleet for nearly decades. And most importantly, she was equipped with an experimental Transwarp Drive. If everything did work as intended, Excelsior could potentially have represented the beginning of a new era of interstellar travel for the Federation. Except, the Great Experiment would ultimately disappear, so you might expect the Excelsior class to have disappeared with it. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Quick interruption before we continue. If you're a Star Trek fan and fancy adding something new to your collection, make sure to check out the Cargo Bay, our very own Star Trek collectibles store. We've got action figures, starships, pretty cool, collectibles, and loads more, with new cargo arriving all the time. And the best thing is, we're now shipping to both the United Kingdom, so the UK, and the USA, so get these while they're available. And plus, as a Trek Central viewer, you can use code TrekCentral at checkout to get 5% off of your order. Any questions, let me know down below. Every purchase helps support what we're doing here at Trek Central and helps us expand the cargo bay to offer more collectibles to people around the world. So make sure to use that link below and we'll see you over there. Alright, back to the video. Under Captain Hikaru Sulu, the USS Excelsior became one of the most famous ships of the late 23rd century. Another Excelsior would carry perhaps the most prestigious name in Starfleet history, as the USS Enterprise-B. And long after Kirk and Sulu had disappeared into the history books, Excelsior-class starships were still seen nearly everywhere. They explored the galaxy while transporting diplomats and admirals. They fought the Borg and then later the Dominion. And one heavily modified Excelsior-class, the USS Lakota, even proved capable of going toe-to-toe with the Defiant. So how does that happen? How does a starship designed during Kirk's era survive into the age of Picard, Sisko, and Janeway? And perhaps most importantly, did Starfleet's Great Experiment actually fail? Today, we're breaking down the entire history of one of Starfleet's most successful and longest-lived starship designs. From the NX-2000 and its controversial Transwarp Drive to Captain Sulu, the Enterprise-B, and the Dominion War, and also the ships which inherited the Excelsior legacy more than a century later. Because this is the story of Starfleet's greatest failed experiment that somehow became one of its greatest successes. To understand the Excelsior, we need to go back to the early 2280s. At this point, the Constitution class had been one of Starfleet's defining starship designs for decades. The USS Enterprise had become legendary under Captain James T. Kirk, and even after her original missions ended, Starfleet didn't simply throw the design away. The Enterprise was extensively rebuilt. This included new warp nacelles, new engineering systems, and updated interiors. Also, new weapons and computers. Basically, every major part of that ship was modernized. But no matter how extensive those upgrades became, Starfleet was still working with a design whose origins stretched back decades. Eventually, you do stop upgrading the old ship, and start designing the next one. Starfleet's answer was the Excelsior class. Construction of a prototype began during the early 2280s at the San Francisco Fleet Yards in orbit of Earth. And aesthetically, you can immediately see what Starfleet was trying to accomplish. Excelsior doesn't abandon the traditional Federation starship layout. You still have the familiar primary saucer, the secondary engineering hull, and the two warp nacelles, and the connecting neck. Put the Enterprise and Excelsior next to each other and you immediately know they belong to the same fleet. But Excelsior takes the formula and pushes it forward. The saucer is larger, the engineering hull is substantially longer, and the nacelles are enormous. The entire vessel feels like Starfleet attempted to create the next great capital ship. That was intentional behind the scenes as well. When Excelsior was developed for Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, it needed to visually communicate that the Enterprise's time was coming to an end. The new ship was described as a new super starship, bigger, sleeker, and essentially the new Queen of Space. And that's important to its role in the film. because Excelsior is almost introduced as a threat to the Enterprise itself. I mean, look at the contrast. The Enterprise is battered, she's aging, and she just survived the Battle of Khan, and Starfleet is preparing to decommission her rather than repair her. Then nearby sits Excelsior, brand new, pristine, and also filled with technology which supposedly makes Enterprise obsolete. The message is clear, this is what comes next. Even its registry reflects their experimental status. Rather than NCC 2000, the prototype initially carried the designation NX 2000. Excelsior wasn't simply another commissioned starship, it was a giant flying testbed. And the technology it was designed to test could have changed Starfleet forever. Inside the Excelsior was the real great experiment, Transwarp Drive. Now, before we go any further, we do need to make an important distinction. When modern Star Trek fans hear Transwarp, there is a good chance you're thinking about the Borg. But we shouldn't assume Starfleet's 23rd century system worked anything like the Borg technology encountered much later. What Starfleet's version actually did internally is never actually explained in detail on screen. What we do know is it did represent a radical new approach to propulsion. Starfleet apparently believed it could make Excelsior extraordinarily fast. The project was significant enough that the ship itself became known as the Great Experiment. And this wasn't simply, we've built a slightly faster warp engine. Starfleet was attempting a genuine leap forward, and not everyone was convinced, especially Chief Engineer Montgomery Scott. Scotty was one of Starfleet's most experienced engineers, but when it came to Excelsior's new propulsion systems, he was distinctly unimpressed.
Up your shaft.
And to be fair, this was the man who spent decades keeping the Enterprise running through situations which should probably reduce the ship to individual atoms. If anyone had earned the right to be suspicious of a fancy new engine, it was Scotty. Nevertheless, Starfleet pushed ahead. By 2285, Excelsior was at Earth's space dock, undergoing final preparations and trials under the command of Captain Lawrence Stiles. And Stiles was certainly confident in his new ship, possibly a little too confident. Of course, then James T. Kirk decided to steal the Enterprise, which is not a sentence that improves Captain Stiles' day. After Starfleet refused to allow Kirk to return to the Genesis planet, Kirk and his senior officers take matters into their own hands. They break Dr. McCoy out of detention and steal the Enterprise from Earth's space dock. At which point, Starfleet has a very large, very advanced prototype sitting nearby, specifically designed to outperform Kirk's ship. So naturally, Excelsior is sent after them. Now this should have been easy. The Enterprise is damaged, she's being operated by a skeleton crew. But Excelsior is brand new, and equipped with a propulsion system that is supposedly going to change Starfleet forever. As both ships get outside, Stiles orders Transwarp Drive. The Enterprise, with its meager warp drive, prepares to escape. So Excelsior powers up. And then stops. Somewhere aboard the Enterprise, Montgomery Scott is having a fantastic day, because before rejoining Kirk aboard the Enterprise, Scotty had been assigned to Excelsior as Chief Engineer, and he'd used the opportunity to sabotage the ship's transwarp computer. Excelsior hadn't simply suffered a catastrophic technological failure, Scotty had deliberately broken it, which does bring us to one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding the Excelsior. Did Transwarp actually fail? I mean, you'll often hear the Excelsior's Transwarp Drive was a complete failure, and ultimately, the Great Experiment itself does not appear to have been unsuccessful. The technology doesn't become Starfleet's new standard propulsion system, and by the time Excelsior is operating under Captain Sulu, the experimental project is no longer part of the ship's story. But there is an important distinction. The scene in The Search for Spock does not prove the Transwarp technology itself didn't work. It does prove Scotty was very good at sabotage. Look at it this way. If I remove several important components from your car and it fails to start tomorrow morning, I haven't necessarily disproved the internal combustion engine working. I've basically demonstrated that you should probably stop inviting me onto your driveway, or move house. The same does apply here. Excelsior's famous humiliation isn't actually a clean propulsion test. So, something else must have happened afterwards. Maybe later testing exposed reliability problems, or maybe it required too much power, or maybe the advantages just didn't justify the complexity. Unfortunately, Star Trek canon does not give us a detailed engineering post-mortem. And that's important, we shouldn't invent one. What we can say is that Starfleet ultimately moved away from that specific project. But while the experimental propulsion system disappeared, something much more important survived: the ship itself. Starfleet may have not created the revolutionary engine it wanted, but underneath that experiment, it created one hell of a starship. So, what exactly had Starfleet built? At approximately 467 meters in length, Excelsior was substantially larger than the Constitution-class vessels which came before it. The ship contained roughly around 34 decks, with a crew complement of around 500 officers and personnel. Despite that increased scale, the basic configuration remained classic Starfleet. Large primary saucer, secondary engineering hull, connecting neck, and 2 warp nacelles mounted above the ship. But almost every element had been reinterpreted. The primary hull is dominated by Excelsior's enormous circular saucer. At the centre sits a bridge module, while a raised structure extends backwards towards the impulse engines. On the underside is a prominent sensor platform, with a distinctive star-like pattern. Moving backwards, the saucer connects to the engineering hull through perhaps one of the strangest parts of the design, the neck. Rather than a relatively smooth dorsal of the Constitution class, Excelsior has this heavily ribbed structure. It's unusual, but it became one of the defining features of the design. So much so that even the Excelsior II would reference it more than a century later. There are also openings along the neck which appear to support cargo and small craft operations. Now below this sits the enormous secondary hull. The engineering section is considerably longer and more integrated than the cylindrical hull of earlier Federation vessels. At the front sits the main navigational deflector. But unlike the exposed dish of the Constitution class, Excelsior's deflector is much more deeply embedded into the hull. It's one of the several elements that make Excelsior feel like a visual bridge between different generations of Starfleet design. At the rear, the ship contains substantial facilities for shuttlecraft and cargo operations. And above everything sits those enormous warp nacelles. Rather than connecting through simple angled pylons, Excelsior uses those distinctive supports, which extend outwards before turning upwards in a sort of right angle. It's another feature which immediately identifies the ship. And considering the vessel was originally designed around experimental propulsion, it's fitting that the entire warp assembly becomes such a major part of its silhouette. Excelsior was also extremely well armed for its era. The ship carried multiple phaser banks around the saucer, neck and engineering sections, providing a broad firing coverage. Photon torpedo launchers gave the ship heavier offensive capabilities, and its defensive shields appear to have been powerful for this period. But the really important thing about the systems isn't what Excelsior carried in 2285, it's what happened later. Starfleet kept upgrading the class. For example, weapons changed, shields improved, computers changed, propulsion systems evolved. The space frame remained, but the technology inside it didn't necessarily remain trapped in the 23rd century. I mean look, eventually one Excelsior would demonstrate just how far Starfleet could push that idea, the USS Lakota. We'll come back to that later. The original NX-2000 bridge was large, bright and incredibly open. Captain Stiles sat centrally, surrounded by duty stations positioned around the compartment. It feels deliberately different from Kirk's Enterprise, newer, cleaner and basically more futuristic. But by the time Sulu commanded Excelsior, the bridge had again changed considerably. The experimental command center had been replaced by something much more familiar to the Starfleet of that period. And that's almost symbolic of what happened to Excelsior itself. The experimental technology disappeared, and the working starship remained. And that starship was about to receive a new captain, a man who had spent most of his career sitting at the helm of a vessel Excelsior was originally designed to replace, Captain Hikaru Sulu. The failure of a great experiment could have easily ended Excelsior's story. Instead, it became the beginning of something much bigger. Because within only a few years, NX-2000 was no longer an experimental prototype. The NX prefix had disappeared. Excelsior became NCC-2000. And sitting in the captain's chair was one of the most famous officers ever to serve aboard the USS Enterprise, Captain Hikaru Sulu. For decades, Sulu had served as the helmsman under James T. Kirk. He'd survived the Enterprise's 5-year mission, Vija, Khan, the Genesis Crisis, the theft and destruction of the Enterprise, and of course, the whole incident involving 2 humpback whales. But by 2287, Sulu had finally received a command of his own. And appropriately enough, Starfleet gave him the ship that had once been intended to replace the Enterprise, the USS Excelsior. By this point, the ship had changed. The experimental Transwarp project had disappeared, the bridge had been redesigned, and Excelsior had transitioned from technological testbed into a fully operational Starfleet vessel. In 2290, Sulu and his crew embarked upon a 3-year exploratory mission into the Beta Quadrant. I think that's an important detail, because despite all the attention given to transwarp, weapons, and eventually the class's military service, Excelsior was still fundamentally a Starfleet explorer. This was the successor to ships like the Constitution-class. Its job was to travel beyond familiar Federation space and find out what was there. Sulu's own crew was connected to several generations of Star Trek history. Janice Rand, who had previously served aboard Kirk's Enterprise, had joined Excelsior, and another officer aboard was a young Vulcan named Tuvok. Long before becoming Voyager's chief of security, Tuvok served under Captain Sulu. Although at the time, he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Starfleet and wasn't particularly enthusiastic about serving alongside humans. So while Sulu was living the dream as captain of the Excelsior, Tuvok was essentially reconsidering his entire career choice. Still, his presence creates this wonderful bridge between eras. One ship connects Kirk's crew directly to a future member of Voyager's crew. And near the end of the mission, Sulu and his crew witnessed an event that would change the Federation forever. In 2293, Excelsior was travelling through the Beta Quadrant when the ship was suddenly struck by an enormous subspace shockwave. The source was Praxis, a Klingon moon, and a major energy production facility. It had exploded. The disaster caused devastating environmental damage to the Klingon homeworld and placed the Empire in an impossible position. It could continue spending enormous resources maintaining its military, or redirect those resources towards preventing a catastrophe. It couldn't realistically do both. After decades of hostility, the Klingon Empire began pursuing peace with the Federation, and Sulu's Excelsior found itself on the edge of one of the biggest political changes in Federation history. Unfortunately, not everyone wanted that peace to happen. A conspiracy involving Federation, Klingon, and Romulan officials attempted to sabotage the peace process. Klingon Chancellor Gorkon was assassinated. Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy were framed, arrested, and sent to Rua Penthe. And when Sulu learned his former captain was in trouble, he attempted to help. Eventually, the conspiracy culminated in the Khitomer Peace Conference. General Chang attacked the Enterprise-A using an experimental Klingon bird of prey, capable of firing while cloaked. Enterprise was taking heavy damage and couldn't locate its attacker. Then Excelsior arrived. There's something wonderfully appropriate about this moment. In the movie, The Search for Spock, Excelsior had been introduced as the ship designed to surpass Kirk's Enterprise. Now, the two vessels were fighting side by side. Spock and McCoy devised a modified photon torpedo capable of tracking the cloaked bird of prey for its exhaust emissions. The torpedo found Chang's ship. Enterprise and Excelsior opened fire, and together they destroyed it. The conspiracy was exposed, the Federation president survived, and the Khitomer peace process continued. Over time, the Federation and Klingon Empire would move from decades of hostility towards an eventual alliance. For Excelsior, this was the moment the Great Experiment truly became something else. It wasn't a prototype anymore, it was Captain Sulu's ship, a successful explorer, and a vessel that played a key role in one of the defining moments of Federation history. More importantly for Starfleet, the design had proven itself, and they were about to give an Excelsior-class vessel the most prestigious name imaginable. In 2293, Starfleet launched the next vessel to carry the name Enterprise. USS Enterprise NCC 1701-B. And that decision alone tells us just how quickly Starfleet's opinion of the Excelsior had changed. Only 8 years earlier, NX-2000 was an experimental ship sitting in space dock with an unproven propulsion system. Now an Excelsior-derived vessel was inheriting the name Enterprise. And the Enterprise-B wasn't identical to Sulu's ship. Its design had been modified with additional impulse structures around the saucer, alternate nacelles, and new structures surrounding the forward engineering hull. We'll come back to the fascinating real-world reasons behind some of those changes later. For now, what matters is the Excelsior platform was already evolving. And on its maiden voyage, the Enterprise-B carried some familiar passengers: James T. Kirk, Montgomery Scott, and Pavel Chekhov. But at the helm was another familiar name: Ensign Demora Sulu, Hikaru Sulu's daughter. As Kirk himself observed, it wouldn't be the Enterprise without a Sulu at the helm. Unfortunately, the Enterprise-B wasn't actually ready for a proper mission. This was supposed to be more like a cruising flight around the solar system. Several important systems hadn't been installed yet. For example, photon torpedoes, they were due on Tuesday, tractor beam, also due on Tuesday. Even the medical staff, you guessed it, Tuesday. And this was unfortunate because Starfleet's newest Enterprise immediately received a distress call. Two transport ships, the USS Lakota and SS Robert Fox, had become trapped inside a massive energy ribbon. They were carrying hundreds of Elorian refugees, and Enterprise was the only Starfleet vessel conveniently close enough to respond. Seriously guys, you've just left the Sol system, surely there'd be more ships anyway. Captain John Harriman had an incomplete ship, an inexperienced crew, and a group of journalists aboard, but people were dying, so Enterprise responded. The crew managed to rescue some of the refugees before both transport ships were destroyed. But then the Enterprise itself became trapped. The energy ribbon began pulling the ship in, and with several of the systems they would normally use still sitting on someone's delivery schedule, the crew needed another solution. Mr. Scott and Kirk devised a plan, which involved the ship's navigational deflector. A Renaissance burst could disrupt the energy ribbon long enough for the Enterprise to escape, but someone needed to modify the deflector systems directly. Captain Harriman initially prepared to go. Kirk stopped him. The captain belonged on the bridge, so Kirk went instead. Now he managed to complete the modifications and the plan worked. Enterprise was able to escape the Nexus, but not before the energy ribbon struck the engineering hull. The section containing the legendary Kirk was torn open, and when Scotty and Chekhov reached the area, he was gone. As far as Starfleet knew, James T. Kirk had died, saving the Enterprise-B on its maiden voyage. Of course, thanks to the movie of Star Trek Generations, we do later discover that Kirk had actually been pulled into the Nexus, but nobody aboard the ship knew that, which is a bit depressing. Unfortunately, we know comparatively little about the Enterprise-B's later canonical career. Eventually, the Enterprise name would pass to the Ambassador-class Enterprise-C, but Star Trek has never shown us what happened to the Enterprise-B between those points. And for this video, that's okay, because the Enterprise-B's significance to the Excelsior story is already clear. Starfleet trusted the platform enough to make it an Enterprise. But while the Enterprise-B would eventually disappear, the Excelsior-class did not. Decades passed, new starships appeared, new technologies transformed Starfleet. The Ambassador-class arrived, then the Galaxy-class, and by the time Jean-Luc Picard commanded the Enterprise-D, Sulu's Excelsior belonged to another era. And yet, ships of the class were still found everywhere, not as museum pieces, not as ceremonial vessels, working Starfleet ships. And as the Federation entered one of the most dangerous periods in its own history, those old Excelsiors were about to prove just how difficult they were to replace. By the 24th century, the Excelsior-class should have been obsolete. Think about how much time had passed since NX-2000 first sat inside Earth's space dock. The Ambassador-class had arrived at this point, then the Galaxy-class. Starfleet computers, weapons, shields and warp technology had all advanced enormously, and yet Excelsiors were still everywhere. They conducted exploration missions, transported senior officials, patrolled Federation space, and also supported scientific operations. And they also served alongside starships designed decades after the original Excelsior first launched. Ships such as the USS Hood, USS Crazy Horse, Cairo, Charleston, Fearless, and Melanche all continued the Excelsior legacy into the 24th century. And importantly, this is a good note, we should not assume every one of these vessels had physically survived since Kirk's era. Many later Excelsiors carried registry numbers far higher than NCC 2000, suggesting Starfleet continued putting ships based on the design into service long after the original prototype. So this wasn't simply Starfleet refusing to retire a handful of old ships, the Excelsior had become a proven platform. And that's key to understanding its longevity. An Excelsior operating during Picard's era wasn't necessarily carrying the same technology Sulu had used almost a century earlier. Starfleet did refit its ships, I mean look at the Enterprise. Of course, the familiar hull typically remained, what was inside could change enormously. And Starfleet clearly still considered these ships useful enough to send them into dangerous situations, including one of the most devastating battles in Federation history. In 2367, a single Borg cube entered Federation space on a direct course for Earth. Starfleet assembled 40 ships at Wolf 359 in an attempt to stop it. The result was catastrophic. 39 ships were destroyed, thousands of Starfleet personnel were killed in action, and among the vessels lost was an Excelsior-class starship, the USS Melbourne. By the way, talking about the Melbourne, there is a big debate on whether it's actually an Excelsior-class or something else. Watch our Wolf 359 video, I'm not getting into it today. Now interestingly, William Reich had previously been offered command of the Melbourne. he did turn it down to remain first officer aboard the Enterprise-D. Thankfully for Riker, he made a good decision there. The Melbourne was actually destroyed with the rest of the battle fleet, but its presence tells us something. When Starfleet needed every available ship to stand between the Borg and Earth, and Excelsior was still considered part of that defensive line. Wolf 359 did change Starfleet. The Borg exposed serious weaknesses in the fleet and accelerated the development of new ships and technologies. Eventually, that would give us vessels like the Defiant-class, the Akira-class, the Sabre-class, and many more. These starships were designed for a completely different Starfleet than the one which created the Excelsior. Now remember that, because we're going to put the two ships of the Defiant and the Excelsior against each other very shortly. Excelsiors continued operating throughout the increasingly unstable years that did follow Wolf 359. One example was the USS Malenche. By 2373, this ship was patrolling near the demilitarized zone and became involved in Starfleet's attempts to capture a former officer and Maquis leader, Michael Eddington. This was a starship based on a design from the 2280s, but is equipped with experimental communications technology almost 90 years later. The Excelsior-class hadn't simply survived, it had kept evolving, and that became increasingly valuable as the Federation faced a new threat, the Dominion. By the 2370s, the Excelsior design was approaching a century old. Then the Dominion War erupted, and Starfleet sent Excelsiors into battle. They served alongside Galaxy-class vessels, the Defiant, Akira classes, and other modern starships during the largest conflict the Federation had faced in generations. They were present within the enormous fleets assembled against the Dominion and Cardassian forces. And no, by this point, an ordinary Excelsior wasn't the most advanced ship Starfleet could field. It didn't need to be. It was still a warp-capable starship with modernized weapons, shields, and a substantial crew. During a war where Starfleet was losing ships constantly, that's valuable. But if you really want to see what the Excelsior space frame was capable of with enough upgrades, we need to go back slightly. Because shortly before the Dominion War, Starfleet took one Excelsior and gave it a serious tactical refit. This was the USS Lakota. And what happened next might be the greatest demonstration of the Excelsior's longevity we ever saw. By 2372, the basic Excelsior-class design was almost 90 years old. The USS Defiant, meanwhile, was practically brand new. And these ships had been created for completely different reasons. For example, Excelsior began life as an explorer and experimental propulsion testbed. The Defiant was developed in response to the Borg. It was small, fast, and heavily armed, protected by ablative armor. It was also equipped with powerful pulse phaser cannons and quantum torpedoes. So if you put an original Excelsior against the Defiant, you'd probably bet on the Defiant. Except the USS Lakota, NCC 42768, wasn't a normal Excelsior. The ship had undergone a major tactical refit. Its weapons had been substantially upgraded, including the addition of quantum torpedoes. Starfleet had taken one of its oldest starship designs and integrated some of its newest weapons technology. And in 2372, Lakota was ordered to intercept the Defiant. The confrontation happened during Admiral Layton's attempted military takeover of Earth. With fears of Dominion infiltration spreading throughout the Federation, Layton attempted to use the crisis to expand Starfleet control. Captain Sisko, thankfully, discovered the conspiracy, and evidence capable of exposing Layton was being carried towards Earth aboard the Defiant. Layton needed the ship stopped, so he dispatched the Lakota. Captain Erica Benteen and her crew had been told the Defiant was compromised by Dominion changelings. From their perspective, they were preventing a Dominion-controlled vessel from reaching Earth. Lakota intercepted the Defiant, and its commander, Worf, refused to surrender, so the two Starfleet ships opened fire. Almost immediately, Chief Miles O'Brien realised something was wrong. The Lakota was hitting them far harder than he expected from an Excelsior-class vessel. Its weapons had been upgraded, and escaping wasn't necessarily easy either. The Defiant could cloak, but lowering its shields during combat would leave it exposed. O'Brien even suspected that Lakota's propulsion systems might have been upgraded alongside its weapons, meaning simply outrunning it wasn't guaranteed. And this old Excelsior gave the Defiant a serious fight. Lakota repeatedly attacked the Defiant, trying to disable the ship, but the Defiant's ablative armor made it extremely difficult to stop. Captain Benteen specifically recognised her armor as one of the reasons her ship's attacks weren't finishing the job. The Defiant returned fire and the Lakota took heavy damage. Eventually, both ships were in serious trouble. And here's the important caveat here. Neither crew initially wanted to destroy the other. The Defiant crew knew Lakota was filled with fellow Starfleet officers, and Lakota's crew believed they were trying to disable a compromised Federation vessel. So this wasn't two starships firing everything they had until one exploded. Then Admiral Layton escalated the situation. He asked Bentine about her quantum torpedoes and ordered her to destroy the Defiant. That's when the truth began to fall apart. Sisko confronted Bentine with the reality of what she was being asked to do. The Defiant had not been replaced by changelings. Those were Starfleet officers aboard the ship. Eventually, Captain Bentine stood down. Lakota powered down its weapons, and Worf ordered the Defiant to cease fire. There was no winner, but by the end of the engagement, both ships had been badly damaged. And that is extraordinary. We shouldn't exaggerate the result. The Lakota did not defeat the Defiant, and the Defiant didn't destroy the Lakota. The circumstances of the battle make a clean comparison almost impossible, but that's not really why the fight matters. What matters is that Starfleet took a design whose origin stretched back to the 2280s, upgraded it, gave it modern weapons, and produced a ship capable of seriously threatening the Defiant. That tells us more about the Excelsior's adaptability than almost anything else. The whole shape was old, the technology inside it didn't have to be. And suddenly, seeing Excelsiors fighting during the Dominion War makes a lot of sense. These weren't better than the newer Starfleet ships, but after decades of upgrades, they were still very useful. And Starfleet had spent generations operating, repairing, and improving them. During a war, you don't throw away useful starships because the basic design is old. You repair it, upgrade it, crew it, and then send it back out there. That's how a starship designed during Kirk's lifetime ends up fighting alongside vessels from Sisko's. But eventually, even the Excelsior had to disappear. Newer generations of Starfleet vessels increasingly took its place. After more than a century, the classic design finally began fading from service. And that should have been the end of its story. Except Starfleet apparently wasn't ready to let the Excelsior go. Because decades later, a familiar silhouette came back. Not once, twice. First with the Obena-class, and then with something even more obvious. A completely new 25th century starship carrying a very familiar name, the Excelsior II-class. So eventually, even the Excelsior-class had to retire, or at least mostly retire. By the end of the 24th century, newer generations of Starfleet vessels had taken over. We had the likes of the Sovereign-class, Akira-class, even the Lunar-class, and many other designs now representing the future of the fleet. After more than a century, the Excelsior had achieved an extraordinary service life. But even as the original ships began disappearing, Starfleet couldn't quite leave the design behind. By 2381, a new vessel appeared which looked very familiar, the Obena-class. The best known example was the USS Archimedes, NCC 83002, commanded by Captain Sonia Gomez. Yes, the same Sonia Gomez who once spilled hot chocolate all over Captain Picard. Apparently her career did recover. I'm not sure I'd recover after that. The Obena was a completely new starship, but its Excelsior inspiration is immediately obvious. You still have the large primary hull, the long engineering section, elevated warp nacelles, and those familiar Excelsior-like proportions. But the design combines that classic silhouette with much more modern Starfleet technology. The saucer is more elliptical, the nacelles evoke ships from the Sovereign era, and the vessel looks like someone took the basic idea behind the Excelsior and rebuilt it for the late 24th century. Which is essentially what makes the Obena interesting to us. More than 90 years after the NX-2000, Starfleet was still returning to that silhouette. Then, 20 years later, they went even further. They brought back the name. By 2401, Starfleet had introduced the Excelsior II-class, and unlike the Obena, it's pretty obvious what Starfleet were doing here. This is explicitly a new generation of Excelsior. At approximately 588 meters long, the Excelsior II was substantially larger than the original. But despite more than a century of technological change, the connection is unmistakable. Broad primary hull, long engineering section, raised warp nacelles, pronounced neck, and even a modern interpretation of those distinctive Excelsior-style pylons. There are references to the Enterprise-B configuration as well, including the prominent impulse structures towards the rear of the saucer. And perhaps my favourite detail is the neck. That strange rib structure that helped define the original Excelsior, yeah, that's back. Obviously it's modernised, but it's unmistakably there. The Excelsior II doesn't simply borrow the name, it deliberately celebrates the original design. And naturally, Starfleet commissioned another USS Excelsior, registry NCC 42037. By 2401, the vessel was serving in Starfleet with Commander Rafe Musica as first officer, and Elnor among the personnel assigned aboard. It participated in the fleet's encounter with the Borg anomaly during the events of Star Trek Picard. But the individual missions of the new Excelsior aren't really an important part of our story. The fact that it actually exists is. Think about the timeline. NX-2000, as we've established, was developed during the early 2280s. The Excelsior II appears in 2401. That's well over a century later. Starfleet had developed countless starships between those 2 points, and yet somebody still looked back at the great experiment and decided, let's build another one. At that point, the original design has moved beyond being merely successful. It's become part of Starfleet's identity. But of course, the Excelsior's distinctive appearance wasn't actually created by Starfleet engineers. It was created by a group of artists trying to solve a rather difficult problem. How do you design the starship that is supposed to replace the Enterprise? And the Excelsior we eventually got was far from the first answer. When the Excelsior was being developed for Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, its role in the story created an unusual design challenge. This wasn't simply another Federation starship. Excelsior needed to look like the future. The Enterprise at this point was old and battle damaged. Excelsior is new, bigger, sleeker, and importantly, more advanced. Essentially, it's the new Queen of Space for Starfleet. So when the two ships appear beside each other in Earth's space dock, the audience need to understand the relationship immediately. Enterprise represents the previous generation. Excelsior is what comes next. And finding that look took several attempts. Early concepts by Nilo Rodis looked dramatically different than the ship we eventually saw. Some designs use a much flatter engineering section underneath the saucer. Others experimented with a very different nacelle arrangement. And at one point, the Excelsior even had 4 warp nacelles. This is a fascinating design, by the way. You can still see elements of familiar Starfleet architecture, but the overall silhouette is almost completely different from the finished ship. And interestingly, some of these rejected ideas didn't disappear forever. A model based on one development design would later appear as a background vessel at a Starfleet shipyard. That's one of the fun things about Star Trek concept art. Just because a design gets rejected doesn't mean it's dead in the water. Sometimes somebody finds it years later and goes, actually we can use that. As development continued, Excelsior gradually moved towards the ship we recognise today. The secondary hull gained more volume, the nacelles moved upwards, and the large circular saucer became dominant. The final result managed to do something very clever. It looked unmistakably like a Starfleet vessel, without looking like another Constitution class. Yet still had a saucer, neck, engineering hull, and 2 nacelles. But everything had been stretched and reinterpreted. In one hand, it was familiar, but in the other hand, it was still new, exactly what the story required. The exterior wasn't the only part of Excelsior that went through different ideas, so did the bridge. One early concept imagined a far more expansive command centre, featuring a large wraparound view of space. It would have given Excelsior's bridge an almost panoramic feel, which is a dramatic idea, although probably not the easiest to actually build and film with, yeah. Instead, the movie gave us the large, bright bridge commanded by Captain Styles. And even there, the production design reinforces the same message as the exterior. This is supposed to feel newer than the Enterprise, cleaner, more spacious, but importantly, more advanced. By the undiscovered country, the bridge had changed substantially, giving Sulu's Excelsior a command centre much more close to the Starfleet aesthetic of this period. And once again, the experimental ship had evolved into something a bit more conventional. Years later, the designers for Star Trek Generations faced another problem. They needed an Excelsior-class ship, and that was going to be the Enterprise-B. Simply reusing Sulu's Excelsior, unchanged, wouldn't make the newest Enterprise feel particularly new, so the design was modified. The nacelles gained additional detailing, extra impulse structures appeared around the saucer, and the forward engineering hull received those distinctive additional sections around the deflector. But those structures weren't added purely because someone thought they looked cool, they solved a practical production problem. The script required the Nexus energy ribbon to smash into the Enterprise-B. That impact needed to tear open the hull and seemingly kill James T. Kirk. But the production didn't want to permanently damage the existing Excelsior filming module. They needed somewhere sacrificial for the Nexus to hit. The additional structures around the engineering hull provided exactly that. They could be damaged with a film without destroying the underlying model. Personally, I absolutely love things like this, because in universe, fans can spend decades asking, what do those structures actually do? Additional engineering systems, sensors, something related to propulsion? Meanwhile, the real world answer is essentially, Kirk needed someone to get hit by the Nexus, so we bolted some stuff on. Production necessity became permanent Starfleet design, and those Enterprise-B modifications became distinctive enough that fans can immediately tell the two Excelsior configurations apart. Be honest, do you know which ones I'm talking about? So why has the Excelsior class remained so recognisable? I think a lot of it comes down to its silhouette. The huge circular saucer, the long secondary hull, basically what we've established in this video. You can remove the registry and remove the name, put the ship entirely in a shadow, and I think most Star Trek fans will know exactly what they're looking at. But there's something else which makes the Excelsior class special. It sits perfectly between Star Trek eras. It's clearly more advanced than the Constitution class, but doesn't look completely out of place besides later Starfleet ships either. And because the class itself remained in service for so long, we actually got to see that happen. Excelsiors besides Constitution class ships, Excelsiors beside Galaxy class ships, and then fighting alongside Defiants. Eventually, descendants of the original design were operating in the 25th century. Very few Star Trek starships have actually managed that, which finally brings us back to the question we started with. Was the Excelsior really Starfleet's failed experiment? Because after everything we've covered, I think the answer is pretty clear. So, was the Excelsior class really a failure? If we're talking specifically about the Great Experiment, then perhaps. Starfleet built the NX-2000 around an experimental Transwarp Drive, intended to represent a major leap forward in propulsion technology. And ultimately, that system didn't become a feature of Starfleet. The Transwarp project disappeared. Excelsior continued using more conventional warp technology, and whatever Starfleet originally hoped to achieve with the Great Experiment, it clearly didn't happen as planned. But the mistake is assuming that means the Excelsior class itself failed, because everything that happened afterwards tells us the exact opposite. Starfleet kept the ship, it commissioned NCC 2000, and it gave that vessel to Captain Sulu. As such, the actual Excelsior embarked on deep space exploration, witnessed the aftermath of Praxis, and fought alongside the Enterprise at Khitomer. Then Starfleet built more of them. One became the Enterprise-B, and by the 24th century, Excelsiors had become so common that nobody even seemed particularly impressed when one of them happened to turn up. They were simply part of Starfleet. These ships fulfilled many roles. Of course, they explored, but they patrolled Federation space, transported senior officers, tested new technology, fought for Borg, and eventually they fought for Dominion. And then there's a Lakota as well, which just basically lets bolt everything on top of it. This isn't the legacy of a failed starship, that's the legacy of an extraordinarily successful one. And perhaps that's the real irony behind the whole Excelsior story. Starfleet thought the revolutionary part of the design was going to be its engine. It wasn't. It was a ship built around that engine. The Great Experiment did not give Starfleet the propulsion revolution it expected. Instead, it gave them a starship design capable of remaining useful for generations. A design adaptable enough to survive enormous technological change. And one iconic enough that, more than a century later, Starfleet would return to it with the Obena and eventually the Excelsior II. When Captain Starr stood aboard the NX-2000 in 2285, he believed he was commanding the future of Starfleet. And in a strange way, he was absolutely right, just not for the reason he thought. The Great Experiment may have failed, but the Excelsior? That became a legend. And there we have it, the complete story of the Excelsior class, from NX-2000 and Starfleet's Great Experiment through Captain Sulu, the Enterprise-B, and more than a century of Starfleet history. But now I want to hear from you. Do you think the Excelsior is one of the greatest starship designs Starfleet ever built? And if you would command any Excelsior, which would you choose? Sulu's NCC 2000, the Enterprise-B, the heavily upgraded Lakota, or would you jump forward to the likes of the Excelsior II? Let me know in the comments, and also, what would you name it? If you've enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more Star Trek Starship breakdowns, lore videos, and deep dives coming your way here on Trek Central. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest Star Trek news and updates. For now, I've been Captain Jack, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Live long and prosper, my friends. Goodbye.